You're standing in line at 29,000 feet, gasping for air that doesn't exist, watching the person ahead of you stop moving and realizing they might never move again. This isn't a queue for coffee. This isn't waiting for a concert. This is Mount Everest's death zone, where dreams and lives end not with dramatic falls or violent storms, but with something far more terrifying: silence. The kind of silence that comes when a human body simply stops fighting. Today, we're diving into 5 of the most haunting tragedies on the world's tallest mountain. The man who died waiting. Don Cash wasn't supposed to die on Everest. The 55-year-old software executive from Utah had already conquered 6 of the 7 summits: Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, Denali. He'd climbed them all with the quiet determination of a man who finishes what he starts. He wasn't chasing Instagram fame. He wasn't trying to break records. He simply wanted to complete a goal that had defined years of his life. Everest was the final piece of a puzzle he'd been assembling through countless training runs and personal sacrifices. In May 2019, Don reached the summit. He stood at 8,848 meters, the highest point on Earth. He called his family on a satellite phone, his voice crackling with emotion. "I feel so blessed." The 7 summits were complete. The dream was done. His family cheered from thousands of miles away. But here's what most people don't understand about Everest. Summiting is only half the battle. More than 80% of deaths happen on the way down. Your oxygen is running low, your body is shutting down, your mind is foggy, and you still have hours of brutal descent ahead. The euphoria of reaching the top can mask the fact that you've just used up most of your reserves. For Don, that descent led straight into a nightmare that would make global headlines and forever change how the world viewed Everest. At the Hillary Step, just below the summit, Don encountered something that shouldn't exist on a mountain: a traffic jam. Over 200 climbers had chosen that same day to summit, creating a bottleneck at 28,000 feet, where every second costs you oxygen, warmth, and life. The weather window was narrow, and everyone was trying to push through it at once. Don collapsed in that line. His Sherpas tried desperately to save him, administering oxygen, performing CPR at an altitude where breathing itself is a luxury. He briefly regained consciousness, eyes flickering open, then slipped away again. They tried to drag him down, but at that altitude, carrying another person is nearly impossible. Your muscles are failing, your lungs are on fire, and helping someone for too long can mean your own death. Other climbers passed by. Some didn't know what was happening. Others were too depleted to help, their own oxygen running dangerously low. Don Cash never made it back to Camp 4. His body now rests just below the Hillary Step, still dressed in his down suit, boots half covered in snow. For a while, climbers used him as a landmark. Turn left after dawn. But here's what makes his story a turning point. May 22, 2019 wasn't just Don's tragedy. 11 people died on Everest that day. 11. An image went viral. A single line of climbers stretching from the summit down to the step. Bodies stacked on a ridge no wider than a table. The world was shocked. The lawyer who finished his dream. Just 5 days after Don Cash's death, the same deadly pattern repeated itself. The weather window was still narrow, the crowds were still crushing, and the mountain was still collecting its toll. Christopher John Coolish was 62, a Colorado attorney from Boulder with a careful, methodical approach to climbing. Like Don, he was chasing the 7 summits, not for fame or social media glory, but for the quiet satisfaction of completing something extraordinary. He'd spent years preparing, checking off peaks one by one. Everest was the last. On May 27, 2019, Chris reached the summit. He stood at the highest point on Earth. The dream was finally realized. He took his photos, savored the moment that years of training had built toward and began the descent. But the same conditions that killed Don Cash were still lurking on the mountain. The bottlenecks, the delays, the thin margins between life and death. Chris made it past the Hillary Step. He navigated the most technical sections. He was heading back to the relative safety of Camp 4 when his body simply gave out. At the South Col, the windswept saddle that serves as the last camp before the summit, Chris collapsed. His teammates and Sherpa guides rushed to help. They gave him oxygen, worked frantically to revive him. For a moment, there was hope. His eyes opened, then there wasn't. The altitude was winning. The cold was sinking in, and the brutal truth of Everest revealed itself once again. Rescue above 8,000 meters is almost impossible. What makes Chris's death so chilling is how close he came to making it. He summited. He descended through the most dangerous sections. He was at camp, where climbers are supposed to be safe. Chris Coolish completed his 7 summits. He achieved his lifelong dream. He stood on top of the world, and he died anyway because Everest demands payment for every second you spend in its death zone. The doctor who survived the quake. If you want to understand obsession, you need to hear about Dr. Roland Yearwood, because in 2015 he stood at Everest Base Camp when the earth convulsed, snow broke loose, and an avalanche triggered by a massive earthquake tore through the tents. 19 people died that day. Climbers were buried, camps were destroyed. Roland lived. Most people would call that a sign, a reason to never return, a cosmic warning to stay away forever. But Roland Yearwood wasn't most people. In 2017, Roland returned. He trained meticulously, studying the route like a surgeon studies scans, camp by camp, hazard by hazard, oxygen plans and backup plans. He knew what could go wrong because he'd lived through the worst. Friends saw his steady grin, his matter-of-fact tone. No bravado, just a quiet promise. One more try. That promise carried him back to Nepal, into a season packed with permits and thin weather windows. The 2015 earthquake had changed the mountain, shifting rock faces and altering established paths. Nothing was quite where it used to be. On summit day, Roland left the South Col in darkness, part of a river of headlamps sliding toward the ridge. The route climbs past the triangular face to a narrow stance called the balcony, an exposed ledge where climbers swap oxygen bottles and catch breaths that never feel like enough. Roland moved with the same methodical precision he brought to medicine. Steady, careful, no drama. He knew this stretch. Old snow, patches of blue ice, fixed lines groaning in the wind. But the balcony is where delays multiply, where one stuck ascender can stack a dozen people in the killing cold. Near that ledge, something went wrong. Not a dramatic fall, not a sudden crisis, just the kind of slow fade that altitude is famous for. A hose icing over, a regulator misbehaving, a mask seal that isn't perfect. Minutes slip away, heat drains, and your decision-making narrows to a single choice. By sunrise, Roland Yearwood was found near the balcony, overcome by hypoxia and exposure. The man who survived Everest's deadliest earthquake had returned to finish what he started, and the mountain took him anyway. Sometimes escaping once doesn't mean you get to escape twice. The climber who couldn't see. Now we need to rewind to 2006, to a tragedy that raises perhaps the most difficult question of all. When does determination cross the line into dangerous delusion? Thomas Weber was 50 meters from the summit of Everest when everything went dark, not metaphorically, literally. Years earlier, Weber had undergone surgery to remove a brain tumor. The operation saved his life but cost him his vision. At sea level, he could manage, but at high altitude, where oxygen levels plummet to a third of normal, his sight faded to nothing. By the time Weber reached 8,750 meters, he was completely blind, climbing in total darkness, with nothing but his guide's voice and his own determination pushing him forward. Think about that for a moment. Blind, in the death zone, with 50 meters left to the top of the world. Every step a gamble, every foothold a matter of trust. Unable to see the drop on either side, unable to judge distances, unable to place his feet with any certainty. His guide, Harry Kickstra, urged him forward, trying to navigate Weber through the final push. But Weber's body was done. His steps slowed to a crawl, then stopped entirely. He staggered in place, unable to find balance, his blindness leaving him completely dependent on others, in a place where everyone is barely surviving themselves. Kickstra made the call, turn back. The summit would remain untouched, but even the descent became a desperate struggle. Weber collapsed into the snow, his breathing shallow, and whispered words that haunt every account of his climb. "I am dying." Moments later, he was gone. Just 50 meters short of everything he'd worked for. Weber's death happened during one of Everest's deadliest seasons, the spring of 2006, when over 40 climbers died on the mountain. The north side route where Weber collapsed became a corridor of frozen bodies, each one a warning that few could afford to heed. His tragedy forced uncomfortable questions. Should a man with failing eyesight have been allowed to attempt Everest? Was it courage or recklessness? And who bears responsibility when commercial expeditions take clients into situations they may not survive? The guides who accept them, the clients who push their limits. Weber wasn't climbing blind out of ignorance. He knew exactly what he was risking. He wanted to prove that his limitations didn't define him. But Everest doesn't care about your reasons. It doesn't bend to willpower or good intentions. Weber's determination was extraordinary. It was also ultimately not enough. The choice no one wants to make, which brings us to 2025, and a tragedy that's still fresh, still raw, still asking questions the climbing community doesn't want to answer. Subrata Ghosh reached the summit of Mount Everest on May 15, 2025. His dream fulfilled, his lifelong goal achieved. But on the descent, he began moving slower than anyone expected. His steps became uncertain, his breathing grew labored. By the time he reached the Hillary Step, the same bottleneck that killed Don Cash 6 years earlier, he could barely speak. His Sherpa guide faced an impossible choice: stay with a client who was clearly failing, risking his own life in the process, or leave him behind and save himself. In the death zone, that's not a hypothetical question. It's a calculation that plays out in real time, with real consequences, with no good answers. Stay too long helping someone and you both die. Leave too soon and you live with that decision forever. What happened to Subrata Ghosh is still being investigated, still being debated, still tearing at the ethics of high-altitude mountaineering. Because unlike the other tragedies we've covered, this one is happening now, in an era of GPS tracking, satellite communication, and helicopters that can supposedly rescue anyone from anywhere. Except they can't. Not at 29,000 feet. Not in the death zone where physics and biology still make the rules, where the air is too thin for helicopter rotors to generate lift. The mountain that was once a test for the world's elite climbers is now a crowded highway where traffic jams kill. So what drives people to keep going? Why do climbers still line up, still pay fortunes, still risk everything for a few minutes at the top of the world? Maybe it's because we need to believe that human will can overcome anything, that determination and preparation can conquer even the most hostile environment on Earth. And every year the question remains, is reaching the top of the world worth dying for? Everest has already answered. We just don't want to listen.